Imagine being so hungry that even the worst food suddenly feels like treasure. Imagine living in a city surrounded by enemies, where no one can leave and no food can enter. Prices rise so high that people sell anything just to survive. Fear fills the streets, and every knock at the door feels like danger. This is where our story begins. The city of Samaria was under siege. An enemy army had surrounded it. They did not attack right away. They simply waited. They blocked supplies and cut off food, letting hunger become their weapon. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The people inside the city grew weaker. Food became scarce, then rare, then almost impossible to find. And hope felt even harder to feign than food. In the middle of this crisis, the prophet Elisha delivered a bold message. He said that by the next day, food would be so plentiful that it would be cheap again. Think about that. The city had nothing. People were starving. And he said tomorrow would bring abundance. It sounded impossible. One of the king's officers laughed and said that even if heaven opened its windows, it could not happen. Elisha calmly replied that he would see it with his own eyes but would not eat any of it. No one understood how such a turnaround could happen in 24 hours. Outside the city gate sat 4 men with leprosy. In those days, leprosy was more than a disease. It meant isolation. They were not allowed inside the city. They were avoided and forgotten. They were already suffering before the famine began. Now they were starving too. One day they looked at each other and asked, "Why sit here until we die?" If they stayed outside, they would die. If they went into the city, there was no food there either. But in front of them was the enemy camp. They reasoned that if they went to the enemy, they might be killed, but they might also be spared. Staying where they were meant certain death. So at twilight, they decided to move. As they walked toward the enemy camp, something felt strange. There were tents standing, horses tied, supplies scattered, but no soldiers. The camp was silent. What they did not know was that earlier that day, the Lord had caused the enemy army to hear the sound of a great approaching army, horses and chariots from distant kingdoms. Fear took hold of them. They believed they were about to be attacked, so they ran for their lives, leaving everything behind. Weapons, food, gold, clothing, all abandoned in their panic. The 4 lepers entered a tent and found food. After days of hunger, they ate until they were full. Then they found silver and gold and clothing, and they hid some of it for themselves. They went into another tent and found even more. For the first time in a long while, they were not hungry. They were alone in a camp filled with abundance. But then something changed in their hearts. They looked at each other and said that what they were doing was not right. This was a day of good news. If they kept silent and waited until morning, they would be guilty. They realized they could not keep this to themselves. So they returned to the city gate and told the gatekeepers what they had seen. At first, the news sounded too good to be true. The king suspected it was a trap, thinking the enemy might be hiding. He sent scouts to investigate. The scouts followed the trail and found the road littered with discarded weapons and equipment. It was clear the enemy had fled in a rush. The siege was over. When the news spread, the people rushed out of the city into the camp. Food was everywhere. Supplies were everywhere. Exactly as Elisha had said, food became cheap overnight. The famine ended in a single day. The officer who had mocked the promise saw it happen, but in the rush of the crowd, he was trampled at the gate. He saw the abundance, but he did not taste it. This story is more than a story about food. It is about perspective. It is about who God chooses to use. The heroes were not kings or soldiers. They were outcasts. Sometimes breakthrough comes through the least expected people. Sometimes desperation pushes us to take a step that leads to deliverance. The enemy was strong, yet they were defeated by fear. And the 4 men understood that good news must be shared. Many people today feel like those lepers, overlooked and standing at the edge while others seem safe inside. But this story reminds us that your position does not limit your purpose. Those 4 men were sitting at the gate, and they became the doorway to freedom for an entire city. While the city was starving, God was already working. The army had fled before anyone inside even knew it. Provision had already been prepared while the people were still hungry. Sometimes the answer is closer than you think. Sometimes the breakthrough is already moving while you are still waiting. The 4 men asked a simple question: why sit here until we die? That question changed everything. By morning, the city that had been starving was celebrating. Families ate again. Hope returned. And it all began with 4 men who decided to stand up and walk forward. When you feel like you have nothing left to lose, you may be closer to discovery than you realize. When you find good news, share it. When you see abundance, remember others. And when fear tries to surround you, remember that sometimes the greatest victories happen in ways no one expects.